talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff. That's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. Happy Friday. It's Friday for us.
Friday for us, for sure. We are recording this one early because we're both on the road next week. I know you're out visiting a client out in the New York City area. I'll be out at the RSA conference in San Francisco. So I'm anticipating my weather will be better than yours, I hope. No offense.
I'll tell you what, I mean, it can't be worse. I'm in the southeast United States, and it has been raining pretty much nonstop. We're getting a bit of a break today, but I was thinking about going and getting some lumber and building an ark because I was really starting to get depressed and worried and all that.
Well, make sure you get the right permits. You don't want to run afoul of the law.
Oh yeah, such a criminal.
So today's topic comes from listener Karim, I hope I pronounced that correctly, about IoT and IAM, or basically Internet of Things and IAM. And Jim, I know you've run a few projects on this. Why don't we start with what is a thing? And that's a loaded question, I know.
What is a thing? Wow, a thingamabob. No, I have been in the focused on this space at various points throughout my IAM career, and I think it's one of the most fascinating and fast-moving areas of IAM. To answer your question, a thing. So normally we think of a thing as a device, but more broadly, it could be a service, a system, an application, or a data source. But usually when people are talking about the Internet of Things, they're talking about devices that are IP aware or network aware and can provide information over the internet. So just kind of some common things that I can think of as common things, things with air quotes. I'm not just using the generic word things because I can't think of anything better, but things that I can think of would be things like thermostat. So I've had a smart thermostat. And one of the things I want to say is it's not just the Nest thermostat that we all think of when we talk about Internet of Things, but it's even basic sensors that are installed in areas that need to take temperature and report them back to the mothership. Webcams, smart appliances like refrigerators, healthcare wearables. So things like, either diabetes testing kits or devices or smart watches, handheld scanners. So you think of like a warehouse environment or a big box store where they have scanners and they can, scan barcodes and plug in information through a user interface. Obviously, a big one now is connected cars, smart TVs, portals, e-citizen portals, home security systems, industrial machines that have, they're collecting various metrics, things like temperature, but other things as well, and reporting those back to some kind of big data system. So were some others coming to mind for you?
I think of you covered pretty much everything. Basically anything that's taking data, right, and transferring it to somewhere else. There's a lot of consumer devices out there, Alexa, right, the Google devices and little pucks that you put around your house that tell it to turn on and off the lights. The light is an Internet thing, the light bulb itself. So I think I got that part. So how is managing the identity of a thing different than managing a human identity?
Okay. Yeah, let me add a little bit more because I just thought of another dimension of this around the things is that, not all things are created equal. So we talk about like panels. One of the IoT projects that I was involved with was around the use of panels in office settings where they were basically connected to the fire system, the emergency management panels. Those were things that were connected to the internet and connected back to main application. Those were pretty smart devices. They were essentially computers that had, a screen on them. But also, like I mentioned, there could be, really dumb sensors within a machine in a factory that is just taking the temperature and reporting temperature back maybe every second or every 5 seconds or every minute. Uh, it doesn't have an operating system, doesn't have a user interface. It's got, very basic capabilities. And most IoT devices use lightweight protocols, but most of them rely on HTTP. So, especially the panels, they're basically internet connected devices. Yet some of those real basic devices aren't even enabled over HTTP, which, as we obviously as we get into this conversation, is going to lead back to, well, how do they use some of the protocols like OAuth 2 and things like that? Might be getting a little bit ahead of myself, but what I really wanted to say is that there's this kind of broad spectrum of what we consider IoT. The panel in your Tesla is much more enabled and much more internet aware than the sensor built into a machine in a factory. So I'm
Yeah,
sorry. So
somewhat.
you asked me a follow-up question. I totally went another direction.
The train keeps rolling. Yeah, I was just curious, from an identity standpoint, how is it different to manage a thing's identity versus a human identity?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is that just think about relationships. So those devices, for the most part, um, especially when in the commercial environment. So this is the thing is really where I was going with that earlier point is that there's such a broad spectrum of what a thing could be. If you are concerned with the connected car, it's a totally different use case than if you're just collecting temperature settings from, uh, you know, a, a machine that is mixing butter or something like that and reporting the temperature just to make sure that the temperature is not getting out of whack. Those are two totally different use cases, but they're both in this bucket of Internet of Things. But kind of in the commercial sense, one of the things that I think is fascinating to think about when it comes to IoT is all these devices. So I mentioned like healthcare wearables. Those are something now that belong to me as a person. So if I want to use that healthcare wearable that gets connected to the internet, and I also want that data to be connected to me and not, be available to anybody else, I have to have a relationship between my human identity and the wearable's identity, or the wearable, however you want to look at it, the thing.
Mhm.
So I've got to build that relationship somehow. I've got to model that relationship, and I think that's one of the key things to keep in mind as you're kind of developing your system is how are you going to create that relationship between the human, or if it's um, the customer might be an organization, the relationship between the device and the organization, or the device and the person. Then you've also, even if it's a device to an organization doesn't know how to manage things. People have to go in there. So there's then the relationship between the person, the organization, and the device. So that's really where I think a lot of the complexity from an IAM perspective can get involved. So it's not, I think when we think of IoT to start with, the first thing that comes to mind is the authentication. How do we, ensure that the person logging into Jeff's Tesla is truly Jeff, right? And that's an important part. But how does that relationship between Jeff's Tesla and Jeff get established? And a lot of times, is Jeff needs to create an identity, and then
Mhm.
the Tesla needs to also have an identity, and then the two need to be linked. And then also think about when we're IM people, so we're always thinking about full life cycle. When Jeff sells his Tesla to Jim at a very good price, well,
Hint,
then
hint.
I want Jeff's relationship with the Tesla to break, and now Jim needs to establish a relationship with the Tesla. And Jeff shouldn't be able to log into the portal at any point in the future now and change settings or things like that. So I think that's one of the really fascinating aspects of IoT is you know, and again, this is, one of the things I think is really important is that a lot of times in IAM, if you're focused on enterprise IAM, it a lot of things are like the company really should change to adopt and embrace best practices, where things are going with identity and access governance, single sign on, um, you know, access reviews and things like that, how somebody gets imported from an HR system, all those kind of, everybody should move toward best practice. This is a whole other, this is still IAM, but, just kind of following the best practice model isn't necessarily the answer. You really need to think about your particular use case and how you're going to solve it. At the same time, there are some um, underlying technologies and standards that you do want to follow.
So yeah, I can see the human aspect of it, right? It's really about relationships. You've got your device, you've got the device owner, and then you've got whatever the control plane is for that device. So there's this kind of three-way relationship that needs to be figured out. And at any point, the device can shift ownership, and that's where you have things like pairing and so forth. So I would imagine when you talk about best practices, a lot of best practices for IAM, some of them may apply, some of them might be different when it comes to IoT specifically. Um, what would be some of the differences maybe between a standard IAM process versus maybe something that's more IoT focused?
Okay, here's a good one. So, registration would be a process where I could see things um, being quite different. So normally when I have to go and register as a human being, there is some identity verification that, they send me an email. I have to click on the email to prove that I have that email address that I plugged in. Um, Similar but different with a device, there's oftentimes a requirement to prove that the device is authentic. So um, not only so that we can, stop hackers, that people aren't just going and trying to create a bunch of fictitious devices, but that also cheaper knockoff versions of those devices can't use all the technology that a company invests in. So if we're talking about kind of a Fitbit or smartwatch, the ability to have that device register with the portal and now be associated to my identity so that I can log into the portal. I need some way to prove that the registration from that device is authentic. And a lot of times those are going to be hard coded or, certificates on the device itself that can be sent to the mothership and verified in some way. So that's kind of one thing I can think of as being quite different.
So where would you track the identity of those devices from a registration standpoint? Would you have like a separate directory or something that you would keep for devices versus humans, or commingle them? What do you think?
Well, it really would depend on the underlying technology that you're managing all this in. So, with a lot of cloud-based solutions, you don't really have to worry about the storage of the data. If you have kind of an premises solution, you say, for example, you have a relational database or an LDAP as your back end. You probably want to have some kind of logical separation between the devices and the people because you're very likely to have a different schema for the data that you store about a human versus a device. But yeah, I really would say that that would depend on the technology that you're using to manage all this.
Yeah, I imagine you keep it separate, and it could, because then that also may help from an authentication standpoint. Um, these devices are constantly connecting, disconnecting to different services, and callbacks and pingbacks and whatever things are going on behind the scenes, and they make it easier to manage from an authentication standpoint as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, it's every time the device needs to report data back to a server or an API. So I kept calling it the mothership. It's
Mhm.
kind of a cloudy term for an API or a server that's waiting for this communication. What's the temperature of the house, for example? Um, it- each time it does that, you don't want to have the human being go over and punch in a code or punch in their password. It's got to be machine to machine. It's got to be able to communicate at the same time. It needs to authenticate in a secure way. And everybody wants to get away from hard coded usernames and passwords. But it's just not secure enough. So you wouldn't want to go into the panel and just have it be a username and password, and then that's what actually gets passed to the server. You want to use something like a token based architecture, something like OAuth 2, where it might take that username and password the first time, but it's going to exchange those for a token or a set of tokens. And from that point forward, those tokens will be used to authenticate to the API, and that will enable the data exchange.
And you'd probably establish some sort of token life, right, or something along those lines, because you don't want those tokens potentially to be out there forever. Because when I sell you my Tesla at a good price, if my token isn't invalidated, and
Right.
you know however that would work from an ownership change perspective, then you don't want to have that reporting back to the person that doesn't no longer own the device.
That's
Um,
right.
yeah. So if
You
it
know, my
comes down, no, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is I think probably rather than getting in and trying to give guidelines for what those timeouts should be, I really think you should work with your technology vendor to understand what their recommended best practices are. And of course, depending on your use case, you just mentioned a really interesting use case there. You may want to adjust. You mentioned that the Tesla, we wouldn't want it to time out. If our device was something that was likely to never change hands, we might be able to use less, network communications or authentications if we were able to stretch out that timeline. But I think it's a matter of kind of working with your vendor, understanding what they recommend.
Right. It's the security versus the usability conundrum, right? Which side is it going to err on? And something that maybe requires more security has a shorter time life, or maybe it authenticates each time, and something that is less on the secure side and more on the usability side would go the other way. So yeah, there is no one size fits all, from that perspective. I wanted to ask a question around the identity themselves. So if we're putting together an IAM system, you typically have an identity source for humans, right? Maybe like the HR system, something like that. You typically have an identity source, or hopefully you would create one for non-employees, let's say. So maybe there's something else, but would you treat an identity source for things differently? Because what I'm thinking here is, pull in all the sources of identity into your IAM platform, and then treat maybe, how would you treat the thing relationship with the human that it would be associated with, as is like an entitlement assignment or something along those lines. But I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on how would you handle the identity aspect within an IAM system, for example.
Right. So, partially I'm going to have to just rest on some of the projects that I had done in the past, which, were on a particular platform, and that platform used on the access management side, used an LDAP as the data store. And in that LDAP, there was a schema for human beings and a schema for things, and they were treated like objects within the directory. Now, if you're going to a different system and you're convinced, obviously you made the decision, you've kicked the tires and you feel like it can handle your IoT use case, I recommend that you would follow the solution that they've outlined in terms of, maybe it is an entitlement, maybe that's how they're going to um, store the things within their system. My experience though has been that the things were objects. The things had a life of them to themselves. In other words, they had attributes associated with them. So a thing might be, a Nest thermometer within my house, but it has a serial number. It has some other attributes that are, maybe a manufacture date. There's some other things that are more dynamic and other things that are more fixed. But one of the things from within an LDAP, making it an object, you have an extensible schema. You can store as much information about that particular object or device as you want.
Yeah, so
I'd
really
say
it comes down to the technology, right? How they tackle that specific use case.
I would, yeah, and what I would say is that, you know more and more of the IAM projects that I've been involved with anyway are moving to cloud-based solutions. So in other words, people are less and less installing their own LDAP and coming up with their own configuration. Most companies don't want to have to deal with that. At the same time, you if you take on a cloud-based solution, the back end of how they're putting it together is either probably a relational database or an LDAP. Potentially, it's a NoSQL like a MongoDB type of database. But even some of the most common household name access management vendors are built on relational databases.
So that relationship is important too, because it seems like it from an IoT perspective, it really comes back to relationship between owner and thing, and making sure that is in the state that it needs to be. What
Right.
about some
Even
other like non-functional things like scale and reliability, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that scale is a really important um, aspect of this. You have to imagine the ability. I mean, IoT is blowing up. It's happening all around us from like smart TVs. Everybody's got a smart TV today. So you can in the past we've talked about large enterprises being 100,000 people or a couple 100,000 people. We talk about big um, customer IAM implementations being 20 million people, 50 million people. Potentially you could get to the scale with IoT where you're talking multitudes of that. And so, and not only that, when you think about people accessing a website to book a hotel or to check their points or things like that, they're not doing it every day, several times a day. Whereas these IoT devices are going out and hitting your services all day, every day. If you have hundreds of millions of devices hitting your services all day, every day, wow, you can really see how you need to have a solution that's going to scale. And I still think, even if you're going toward the cloud service, you have to do your due diligence in terms um, of doing proper load and performance testing, because you definitely don't want to run it. If you're at that scale and things come down, you're probably going to end up on the nightly news, and it's just going to be embarrassing for your company. So I think it behooves us all to do our due diligence and not just accept blanket answers. And usually people who are responsible for those these types of solutions at this scale, they know that, right? They've got their battle scars.
Yeah.
In terms of reliability, it's just it's the same thing. It's like you really just can't have your services go down. If your website goes down for an hour or something, sometimes that's fine. If you've got some kind of medical device like a diabetes um, tracking, blood sugar tracking system, or things that obviously have to do with people's life and death situations. But even not, even if it's temperature control systems in a warehouse or in a factory that's running 24 hours a day, those systems need to be up and available. So reliability is extremely important.
Yeah. What about the security aspect of it?
Um, I think from a security, this is the big thing. There's everybody's out there, or I shouldn't say everybody's out there, but there are a lot of people out there trying to break into systems all the time. And a lot of times these Internet of Thing devices are the targets because of things like um, you know, them not being updated. So if they have firmware that never gets updated, they've got an old system that maybe has security flaws. They might use default or weak passwords. They also might be able to, if they're sitting on a corporate network or even in a home network, be able to bridge traffic within the that network. So one of the things that I had heard this a while back and just kind of thinking through it out loud was that a lot of corporate printers that are network enabled have Wi-Fi capabilities as well. So they could be like a Wi-Fi hub. And so one of the ways that hackers were starting to try to break into corporate networks was they were using drones, landing on top of corporate buildings and
Hmm.
trying to scan for Wi-Fi, which would be on, say, a printer, and then be able to bridge through. So, you can obviously see that's a huge security flaw.
Yeah. Um, the Wi-Fi pineapple is always an interesting story to talk about. But okay, I know that there is a website. It's IoTsecurityFoundation.org, and they have a lot of kind of more information behind the scenes on some of the things to consider as well. So I'll be sure to put that as a link in the show notes. Is there anything else from an IoT IM perspective that you want to talk about?
No, just was thinking about something I just said there around firmware. Firmware really seems to be like the potential downfall. I mean, you get a printer or a scanner or anything that has firmware. It feels like every time you go and check to see if there's new firmware, there is, right? And so it can get out of date very quickly. And a lot of times, security is driven through, updates to firmware. And I would think, if you're an IM practitioner, kind of getting into an IoT project, here's maybe a non-functional requirement. Can your IAM system check the level of firmware of the device that's connecting and make sure it's at the appropriate level, and then take action if it's not? Not necessarily block the authentication, maybe block the authentication depending on the use case, or maybe at some level triggers an alert back to an administrator or to some kind of workflow to you know make sure that the issue gets addressed. Again, it's so dependent on the use case. If you're talking about enterprise IoT and you're finding out the firmware of certain devices is out of date or not up to standard, well, now you can start to catalog which ones are out of date. Now, if you're in a big B2C type of solution, well, maybe you want to block the authentication or send an email to the person who has the relationship with the device and let them know firmware is out of date. There have been security patches made to this firmware since then, so please update.
Yeah, the validation of that firmware is important. I know that that's one of the areas that, like for mobile devices, cell phones, for example, um, is an area that you have to be kind of careful around. So iOS, has their certificates, and they stop signing old versions of their OSs and firmware updates that are associated with it to try and combat that, because that used to be, I'm sure it still is, a way to kind of backdoor your way into a device if you're trying to do to get access to something maybe that you don't have normal access to.
Yeah,
Um, okay, what else?
that's all that's on my mind at the moment.
That's it. It's Friday.
Again,
Is it Miller time?
it should be. I've got a few more things to do, and then yeah, a crack cold one.
All right. Well, then let's leave it there for now. I want to thank Karam again for that email and that question. Hopefully that helps. If you've got questions for yourself and you want to send them to us, you can send them at questions at identityatthecenter.com. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close this one out, and we'll talk to you in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.